Good evening and welcome. I'm John Goodman, Deacon and Lead Church Planner of Christ Church of the Rio Grande Valley. Thank you for joining us for the second night of our church's virtual education week. We're a new church, about 1.5 years old, and this Sunday we'll regather for the first time since quarantine began in a new location at Downtown Cafe on Conway Avenue in Mission, Texas, 10:30 a.m. In addition to the time we spend together as friends on Sundays and throughout the week, we also look for ways to give back to our community, and this virtual education week is one of the ways we're doing that, even as we're physically separated. In addition to being the pastor here at Christ Church, I'm also an English teacher in a public school district here along the border of the United States and Mexico, where for the last few years, I've used excerpts of a book by Francine Rivers with my middle and high school students. For the first few minutes, I'm going to talk with Mrs. Rivers about what it's been like to be a teacher using her work, because it's important for teachers and parents to see the benefit of doing so. But the majority of the evening is for our kids. We're going to open the floodgates and let them ask Mrs. Rivers anything they'd like, which is making me a little bit nervous, but that's okay, about being an author, about redeeming love, really anything they want to ask her, which she can feel free to respectfully decline to answer. Of course, I should say that too. Let me give her a proper introduction. Mrs. Rivers is a New York Times bestselling author, a member of Romance Writers of America's coveted Hall of Fame, and a recipient of the Lifetime Achievement Award from American Christian fiction writers. She wrote Redeeming Love as a statement of her Christian faith, and she recently completed the screenplay for its film adaptation that I mentioned a moment ago, which will be available in theaters next year. In fact, Mrs. Rivers is famous not only for this particular work, but for numerous best-selling novels which have been translated into over 30 languages. Mrs. Rivers and her husband live in Northern California, and they enjoy time spent with their grown children and grandchildren. Mrs. Rivers, welcome.
Nice to be here with you.
As I said, we have kids who are eager to ask you questions, but before I get to them, I want to personally thank you for your work and what it's meant to my students. Not all parents and people on the call might be familiar with Redeeming Love, and we weren't able to finish it this year in class due to coronavirus. So I was wondering if you might be willing to summarize your own story for us in your words and what the important parts to you are of that story.
Oh boy, I wrote it 30 years ago. I think the important parts are that no matter what people have been through, there is redemption, and God wants to reach out to them. It's a love story, and it's really an allegory about Christ. And people have sometimes a view of God that they have to earn their way or they have to be perfect before they can come to the Lord, and that's not true. He's looking and he's searching and seeking each of us.
Well, I also want to share, by the way, that I unfortunately had to redact certain portions with my sixth graders that were perfectly fine to share with my high school students. So,
oh yes, yeah.
I should just say that at first. So certainly, though, there are themes at work that I at least felt as a teacher, we have responsibilities to share with our students, with our children. I told you I wanted to share 3 quick vignettes so that parents and teachers get an idea of the kind of discussions that your work can start. So the first one's from a few years ago. After my high school English class, they read the prologue of Redeeming Love. I divided the class into boys and girls. And so with the girls, I led a discussion on how the boys in their lives have treated them and where they thought that their self-worth comes from. And with the boys, I encouraged them to think through the effects that the way that they treat their girlfriends would have on these young ladies, even if they don't end up together and they don't see each other in the future. So the second one is that one of these female students came up to me after class and actually shared with me that she had been touched inappropriately by someone in her family, and she was finding the courage to talk about that with trusted adults because of reading your work. And then third, this year, and this one's a mixed bag, I watched several dozen sixth graders, like Ismail on the screen here. They fell in love with this story, but at first, of course, they were too innocent to realize what this story was going to show them about some of the ugly things that adults do to children. And I think that, we paired it with some nonfiction readings on human development and human trafficking, which is a really troubling problem here in Texas. We have 1/4 of all sex trafficking victims in the U.S. here enslaved in Texas at any time. And living here on the border, a lot of that trafficking happens here, typically to students the age of our kids. So I'd like to know, do you know of any other people using your work to talk to kids about these kinds of things? And is that something that you hoped would happen?
Actually, I didn't even think that that's what would happen. When I started writing it, I really was basing it on the book of Hosea from the Bible about the prophet who's told by God to marry a prostitute. And when I first studied the book, I felt like Sarah, Angel, because I felt like I had turned to everything else that there was in order to find, happiness, and never really turned to God. And defiant, I was the 60s. I went to school in the 60s, and that carries a lot of history, which we won't go into. But I wanted to write the story, and to try to get into the girl's mind. I ended up reading a magazine, and there was an article in there about a little girl, and they had 3 pictures. One picture was of her as, like a 6-year-old first grader, beautiful little girl, very innocent. And the second picture, she had disappeared. The second picture was her, and they'd confiscated a pornography film. And she was terrified, just the look of terror on her face. The third picture was of her at about the age of 12, and the total change in her. So I had those 3 pictures posted on my bulletin board behind my desk, and I kept thinking, I'm writing this story for that little girl. But I never really made the connection on how it would be used until years later. I was invited to speak at a conference on prostitution, and there were 300 other participants there, and they were from all over the world, and they were involved in fighting sex trafficking. When I was initially asked to speak there, I thought, well, why would they want to hear me? I mean, I don't know. I'm not an expert on that whole issue. And they said, you have no idea how the book is being used all over the world as an outreach, and to help these young women and young men to understand that, no matter what's happened to them, God can restore them and can heal them, and that he loves them. But, people do horrible things to each other. And that was the hardest part about writing the book, is dealing with the character of Duke.
And by the way, I think there might be some parents who are listening to this go, wait, what did my kids read this year?
Yeah, I'm sure. I'm sure.
Yeah, so Angel and Sarah.
Getting you into trouble here.
I'm going to go the way of Socrates and corrupting the minds of the youth here. Give me the hemlock now.
Well, the problem, this sad part is it's these young kids that are that are the victims.
Yes.
I mean, 11 years old, 14, that's the prime age that the traffickers are taking.
Yes, and it's here. I mean,
it's happening here in California too. So it's all over the country.
Now, Angel and Sarah, of course, for people who read the book, they're the same character, but I really love the way that, the name change, which happens for reasons in the book, but it's also, I think, a wonderful picture of the way that we see ourselves and our identity, and how our very name is taken away from us when people are in prison like that. So a little bit of the backstory in the prologue that we read with our class. Sarah is this adorable little girl, and she's really excited that her father is coming to see her. It's the first time she's going to meet him. He lives out of town, and we quickly find out that her father, Alex Stafford, wants nothing to do with her. He's an absent father. She's an illegitimate child. He has a family somewhere else, and Sarah is a witness to some horrific domestic violence, and she hears her own father say that he wishes that his mistress would have found a way to get rid of this baby. And this is how we're introduced to Sarah. And by the end of this sad prologue, her mother, who is swept up into a life of prostitution, passed away. She's sold into sex slavery. And Duke, that you mentioned, is the character who really just destroys her, destroys her innocence and takes it. But even before that, one of the things I noticed is that she's already got bad messaging going into her head from Cleo and from her mother. She's already being told by the women in her life, not just the men, this is how all men are, this is normal, you're just going to have to grow up and learn this. I mean, is that something that you have seen in young women's lives that really motivated you to write this work?
I think I have seen it more so after the book was written, because I've become involved in ministries with sex traffic victims. And you hear their stories and you hear their backgrounds, and plus letters that came to me after the book came out. And people tended to share their whole history of what went on and how it paralleled their own lives, which was kind of appalling to me. But because I kept thinking I'm writing about the 1850s, I really had no clue what was going on right now and what was going on 30 years ago, and now it's pandemic.
Sure.
So it was that, actually that first 50 pages was the hardest thing I've ever had to write in my writing career.
Oh, wow.
I didn't want to go into that little girl's mind.
Yeah.
I didn't want to feel what she was feeling. And I had sent the 50 pages to a good friend of mine who's a writer, and she said, you know, why aren't you writing the way you normally do and going in? I said, well, because I just don't want to feel what she's feeling. She said, you know, that comes with the job. You have to just get in there and really get down into the heart of the character.
Well, I know I have 100 questions, and I did promise that tonight would be mostly for students. So I will say, I've told adults that we might let them ask some questions if they promise to bless a child in their life. So we have to exactly from them. But before we get to any questions, let me explain how this is going to work over Zoom. First, while I'm moderating the discussion, you probably already noticed I'm being assisted by a student panelist. Ismail is an upcoming 7th grader at Lorenzo de Zavala Middle School. He says that Mrs. Rivers' work is among the best things he's read, not only in 6th grade, but since kindergarten, that this is one of his favorite things. He's not going to be graduating high school till 2026, but after that, he plans to join the Marines. Hello, Ismail.
Hello, everybody.
He's got some questions from some of our 6th grade students that he's going to be asking on behalf of students who couldn't be here tonight. Ismail?
So first of all, we have a student named Isai. He wants to know what inspired the author, Mrs. Rivers, to write a story like Redeeming Love.
It really started with a Bible study. My husband and I were struggling in our marriage when we moved up to Sebastopol, and we ended up going to church, or I started going to church out of desperation. And then I asked the pastor if he'd be willing to teach a home Bible study, because I couldn't get Rick to go. So if you can't get your husband to church, you bring the church to your husband. And we started doing Bible studies, started doing the minor prophets. And when we came to Hosea, it really just broke my heart. I think that reached me. I'd been raised in the church, but I would say that I had head knowledge about Christ, but I didn't really have heart knowledge. And that book just broke me open. And I felt I had a writing career in the general market for a number of years. And I couldn't write for about 3 years. And that particular story in the Bible just opened the door again. And I ended up writing it really to share what was happening in my own life, how I felt like I had been a child of darkness and I was defiant and fighting God. And then I was afraid to really become a Christian, because you think, a lot of times you think of being a Christian, everything gets taken away, which isn't the case. And then how you come to the point of surrender, and then you understand, you humble yourself before the Lord, and then he shows you and directs your life, and then you have joy. So it was really a search. A lot of my writing comes from a question that I have in my own life, and I'm trying to find God's perspective in that. And so I use the characters in the story to kind of work through my own issues. So that one was about, who is Jesus and what's this all about?
And for those who don't know the story of Hosea, by the way, this is an ancient prophet in the Northern Kingdom of Israel, and God is trying to show Israel how much he cares about them, even though they've been rebellious, even though they've walked away. And he has one of his best prophets. He basically tells him to go and marry a woman like Angel after she becomes Angel. And so she meets him, and then he has to go buy her back out of that kind of life, which, spoiler alert, happens in Redeeming Love. Hosea have to go and buy her back. And the whole point is to show people that even if you've done these things that are wrong, that there's somebody who wants you back. There's somebody who loves you enough to buy you back out of those things. And so we see that in Hosea, we see that in redeeming love. But anyway, just to share a little bit about that, I'm sure Ismail has another student question queued up, ready to go.
Okay.
So the other question is by the same student, Isai. He says, were there any events beforehand that led to Alex leaving Sarah's mother and thus the story of Sarah?
Oh no, no. He basically she made the decision as a young woman to follow Alex Stafford and left her parents' house, and then he sets her up in her own home, and she's his mistress. He never has any intention of marrying her. And then when she becomes pregnant with Angel, Sarah, she was Sarah in the beginning. That's it. I mean, as far as he's concerned, the relationship is over.
Now, that's not actually written in the prologue specifically, the backstory. So how is that?
It's kind of feathered into the backstory, because you know that when she goes to her parents' house to try to reconnect with her parents, her mother is telling her, no, you're dead to your father. You left, you're gone. So that kind of tells you that she was in their house and decided to leave. Was wooed away by Alex Stafford.
So just a good warning to young women not to be wooed into men who have no good intentions to.
Well, and certainly not with a married man, because she knew he was
Sure.
a married man.
Yeah. Always trouble. Ismail, do you have another one lined up?
So the next question is from a student named Javier. His first question is, what was your favorite part of the book?
Oh, the ending, of course. I always like a happy ending. You have this long journey, and a lot of times I go through this with my books, that it takes a long time and the development of the story, but with Christ, you're going to have a happy ending. So I liked the ending.
Now, by the way, Javi, the student who asked this question, he, just to let you know a little bit more about him, he chose the nickname Cockroach. He's an interesting young man. And I gave him the opportunity to take another nickname, and he said, no, I'm going to stick with that. And I said, well, I at least need to call you Mr. Cockroach. It's more respective. So he's Mr. Cockroach. I don't know why.
I was going to ask you why.
No, he's a prodigy child of ours at the school, and he just likes to be different. So I love that kid. Well,
they've survived everything and lasted for many centuries, and they are survivors. So maybe that's part of it.
Yeah, I hope so.
Yeah.
Does he have another question? Does Javi have another question, Ismail?
Yes. His next question is, what were your inspirations for creating Sarah / Angel?
Oh, Sarah, the inspiration for her really came from those 3 pictures that I had on my bulletin board. I felt like I was writing for that little girl, because I wanted that little girl, wherever she was, if she ever read the story, that she would know that she was loved. There's a way out, and she's loved.
Ismail, I'm going to go ahead and just turn it over to you, buddy. If you want to keep going through those questions, I'm going to sit back here and give you some hands-on leadership experience here. So you can ask whichever ones you think are appropriate to ask.
All right, thank you for the answers there, Miss Rivers. The next question is by B. What was something that was surprising for you yourself that you discovered in the book?
Oh, that's a good question. I think the surprise, I'm not really surprised, but just the relationships that she had with the other prostitutes, and as their stories came out, because a lot of times when you're writing, other characters come in that you didn't really plan in the original plot line, and they just had their own story to tell. So Lucky would be one that I thought was something of a surprise, and I liked her a lot.
Thank you for that answer. Our next question is by a student named Minelli. She wants to know, why did you write this book?
I think I've already shared that answer, that I really was doing my own search and trying to find out about Jesus and what what his love is like. And that's when I read the book of Hosea, that really kind of defined for me Jesus's love, and it helped me really to understand the gospel, I think, more than actually hearing the gospel. And I don't know why that is, because I had grown up in a Christian home. I never had the background that she had either, which I found very difficult to experience. You know, when you're writing a story, you really are getting into the character and you're experiencing what the character is experiencing. But I didn't come from that background, so I did have to do a lot of research and reading and doing studying on that kind of thing, which was difficult.
And can I also, I'm aware that you wrote books before Redeeming Love, and you didn't write for a while after you became a Christian. Can you share a little bit about that with the students?
You may not want me to. My previous career was steamy historical romances in the general market.
Oh, okay.
And it was actually, when I became a Christian, I flat out couldn't write. It's like God absolutely closed that door. I couldn't make any sense of any stories that I wanted to do. And I started working with my husband. He had started a family business. And when it ceased to matter to me, I think that what I learned in that 3 years was that writing had actually become an idol in my life. It was kind of where I had my identity. I could escape into my writing. And God was dealing with me for that whole 3 years. And I think when I came to the book of Hosea in that Bible study, it was like God saying, well, you know, you've been writing love stories for the last 10 years, but you don't really know what my love is like. And my love is true love. And it was like all of a sudden he opened the door again and the story just was there. I got all the rights back to those books and they're no longer published. And I always told people, don't read anything before, you know, like 1991, which was the first edition of Redeeming Love. And then I got the rights back and I redeemed the book because there were things in the original that are a little bit rougher than the Christian market wanted. And so I was able to put in the conversion scene, which was not in the original.
Ismail, do you have some more questions lined up from our other students?
What did you do to get into Angel's state of mind? In other words, what did you do to feel what Angel was feeling during her storyline?
Oh, that just absolutely imagining it. Just trying to put myself into her mindset, imagining myself as a little girl and going through all that. Pretty horrendous, frankly. It was not a place I wanted to be, but it's a place I had to go. Some things are very hard to explain, you know, as a writer, you know, I don't have the words to explain sometimes the process that a writer goes through to get into that kind of a mindset. There are a lot of times when I dream at night. Your mind kind of relaxes before you go to sleep, and then you start to think about things and go over the story, and then you dream. So.
Thank you for that. From a student named Madison. How long does it take you to write the book?
That book took me about a year. But I've written other books that have taken me, well, I did one book and it took me 3 years because I wrote almost 1,200 pages and then I didn't like the book and I tossed it and started over again. And because the character, it just didn't work. You can keep working on something that you decide it just isn't working. Started it over and it ended up being 2 novels. It ended up being about 4 different generations of mother-daughter relationships. So it depends on the project, but usually about a year, anywhere from a year to 3 years to write a book.
How hard is it to take something you've spent that much time on and throw it away? I mean, are you ever tempted to say, you know, I don't like this, but it's a lot of work and somebody will like it, so I'll go ahead and publish it? Or are you more like, no, absolutely not, I really got to get rid of this and just start?
It's usually, no, absolutely not, I've got to get rid of this. Put it through the shredder, yeah, because I thought I didn't like some of the characters, and I thought if I don't like them, the readers aren't going to like them.
Mm-hmm.
So I needed to do a lot more research and studying, and it was a very personal story because it was really about my grandmother and my mother's relationship, and then about my generation, my daughter's generation.
Mm-hmm.
So I needed to do a little more digging.
You know, the characters really are lifelike in Redeeming Love. I think that's one of the reasons I chose to do it with our high school students at first. I was just getting tired of canned writing in our textbooks. We're supposed to be teaching characterization, you know, based on, as a teacher now in Texas, we're teaching what does the character say, what do they think, what effect do they have on others, how do they act, and how do they look. So STEAL, STEAL. And it was really hard to do with some of the canned writing, but you pick up Redeeming Love and it's just chock full of, you can feel what Sarah's thinking. You can see the way the abuse is happening. You can see the longings of her heart and the effects that the people are having on each other. It's a very realistic story. You know, though, before spring break, most of my students told me, I asked them, what do you think is going to happen to Sarah when she grows up? And they said, well, we think that she'll grow up and she won't be like her mom. She'll choose a better life for her. And I said to the students, you know, there are two problems with that. First of all, she was trafficked. She didn't get the chance to grow up and have a normal life. But the second problem with that is that children who've been abused, they tend to define normal as whatever they experienced when they were kids. And so even if she hadn't been trafficked, what she heard from her mother and saw her go through, what she heard from Cleo telling her about men, that was normal to her. So as I was telling the students, some things become obvious in time.
Yeah.
Physical abuse is bad. But other things, like the way that we grow up talking to boyfriends, girlfriends, spouses, brothers, sisters, that's set really early. And, you know, those are deeply embedded mental images that we have. And I see this come out in Angel in her quick tongue. She has got a very quick tongue. I'm just wondering if you planned for that dynamic to kind of come out where she's real defensive. She's real on the inside, but on the outside, she's trying to be quick-witted. And
yeah, she's fighting, and she's really a survivor. She hates her life. She literally hates her life and wants to die. And she's pushing, and there's one scene in there, and I think it's McGowan, where she is literally pushing him in order for him to kill her, because she just wants it over with. So that, and I'm reading some of the materials about victims. Now I'm learning more now than I knew when I was writing the book, of the dynamics, you know, of how they literally take away their identity. And a lot of kids, before they even end up in trafficking, they're being groomed. You know, they're being taught and they're being conditioned so that they don't have their own identity. They don't have that self-confidence. They don't know how they don't know their worth. They don't see their worth, especially in the eyes of God.
After we switched to online learning, I told my students, these things are like water to a fish. I mean, do you think fish know that they're in water any more than you know that you're in oxygen? These things are just totally normal. But I saw even more in the high school than in middle school. There are these young women who think that if they find a guy who treats them well, like Ismail certainly will do one day, but if they find a guy who treats them well, then they're good. All their problems are solved. It's just a matter of finding a man who's a good guy. And I was wondering if maybe you'd help me dispel that myth tonight.
No, I think that, you know, it's great to have a good guy.
Sure.
I mean, I have a good guy. We've been married for 51 years, but I had to also find out, who am I? And who am I in relationship to God? What does God want me to do? Because we're individuals and we're called to different things. And I think it is good to pick somebody, if it's, you know, a life partner, who's going to encourage that. So that, because you have a search, you have a journey of your own that you have to go on. You can't rely on somebody else to make you happy. You know, you're responsible for your own happiness. I think it was Abraham Lincoln that said, you're only as happy as you make up your mind to be. So don't look for it in some other person to make you happy. That puts tremendous expectations on another person that they can't fulfill. a lot of times what you're looking for is that relationship that you can have with God that another person isn't going to be able to give you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and but you do seem to show that Michael is one of those good guys, like you talk about.
Yeah.
He is one of those good
Well,
guys.
Michael is originally I wanted him to be like a representation of Christ. He's trying hard to live the way Christ lived and to live that Christian life
Mhm.
and to hear her out and listen and learn. But it also, what I was trying to show for him too, is it's not an easy walk. He had a very hard time and he was fighting with his own emotions and anger. And he also came from an abusive background. So you see these two people that had abusive situations in the beginning with his father, a slave owner, and beat him at one point and kicked him out. And but it's what did he turn to, and how did his life turn out, and what is he trying to show Angel? It's like you didn't choose the life you have, but you can choose the life you want. Is the message. But it's all a matter of choice. What are you going to choose to do?
But one thing that I got pushback with from some people who didn't really understand the story or what it was about was that, are you trying to tell young women that they need to find a good guy to solve their problems and they can't be independent? Right. And I think that you've hit the nail on the head. You already answered this when you said, actually, Michael was a good guy, and Angel she was still running away. She was still self-sabotaging. The decision had to come from within her that she was going to choose to try to have a healthier relationship with her husband.
You can't let your past be a prison for the rest of your life. You have the choice to be free. And you look back in time when there were Christians that were locked up, you can still actually be free in a prison if you're in Christ.
Yeah.
It's a mindset. What is the decision of your mind? Where is your mind?
Now, you've said that one of the reasons that you didn't approve of any of the other screenplays people wrote before was because they didn't get Michael Hosea. Can you
not understand him?
Yeah. Can you help us to understand him?
Well, he's a tender heart. He has a heart. He has a heart that wants to beat for God, basically, and it's not an easy path. So it's sacrificial. It's humble. It's caring more about her, that not necessarily more about her than he cares about himself, but cares more about her than anything else to try to show her that she can be free. So, and as far as my husband and I have known my husband since 5th grade, and we're partners. We uphold each other, friends and lovers, long time marriage, but not without difficulties too. We've had our ups and downs.
As I've mentioned earlier, there are certain adult themes at work that I gingerly redacted from the excerpts that we shared, but I can assure you that only piqued the interest of the students who were trying to see through the
I'm sure.
lines that I had written. But I do remember having a parent saying, "Why are you even learning about human trafficking? Why are you doing that with the kids?" And I would love for you to maybe answer that, not head on perhaps, but maybe kind of from the side a little bit, and giving some helpful advice to teachers and parents who say, you know what, I do think this is something I need to raise as a discussion with my children, but I have no idea how to do it. How do you talk to kids about the themes that you have woven into Redeeming Love?
That is a good question. I think it's good if the parents and the kids read the book together and they can talk about the book. That would be a big help. I think it's kind of hard to just open up a discussion, but I think, like if they're watching a movie or you're watching a TV show or whatever, I think whatever there is, with my kids, we used to talk about commercials. You're observing a commercial, but what are they really selling you here? Take a real close look and use your critical thinking brain to figure out what's really going on. And our culture is, it fans some of this stuff. And especially young kids. And how many things do we know that they're seeing on the internet when we're not watching over their shoulder? So I think it's important to tell them that, you know, there is seduction going on, even at their age, that they need to be protected from and taught about to avoid. So I don't know if that helps.
Well, so interestingly enough, that seems to be a theme this week, at least so far. We had a speaker last night. She's also a Californian. She's a licensed psychologist and seminary professor in the School of Psychology. She gave very similar advice about opening up discussions, as far as she even mentioned commercials. She said that with her kids, she'll even ask her kids, what do you think that commercial is trying to sell you or trying to get you to?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, I think it's great advice. But yeah. Anyway.
Well, in anything, I mean, listen to the songs that they're hearing and literally lay out the lyrics and say, okay, what are these lyrics teaching you? And what's the lie here that you're being fed that's preparing you for something that you really don't want any part of, but you're being gradually seduced into that kind of thing. You know, the Psalms are great for teaching, because there's every emotion that human beings feel right there in the Psalms hanging out. And I think that God wants us to do that, is take our feelings and all that stuff and be honest with God. He knows it all anyway.
Yeah. One of our students is asking a question in the chat. She wants to know, what got you into writing books in the beginning? So maybe even before your conversion, what got you into just wanting to be an author?
Yeah, I've always wanted to be a writer. I don't know why, but I knew, my husband says there were only two people that we went through school with who actually, they knew what they wanted to be when they were kids, you know, young, kindergarten, first grade. And I wanted to be a writer, and one of our other friends wanted to be a ship captain, and he became a ship captain, and he was a captain on the big oil tankers and all that, went all around the world. But I knew I was going to be a writer. I didn't know what I was going to be writing. I went to college and majored in journalism, and my major was English with an emphasis in creative writing. Minored in journalism because, you know, on one side you get the prose, the other you get the who, what, when, where, and why, the facts. Yeah. And I didn't know what I was going to do. Then I wasn't a reader. I was never a very good reader. And it was actually my mother-in-law who started giving me books, fiction books, because my parents were nonfiction readers. My dad was a police officer. My mother was a nurse. And they were always reading nonfiction and journals and that kind of thing. And the fiction, I loved it. I loved the mysteries. I loved the romances. I loved the historical. So the first book I wrote was a combination of all three genres. So I called it a Western Gothic romance. Didn't really fit the genre, but it actually sold miraculously. But I think what got me started is I was reading short romances, and I was telling Rick, you know, I think I could write this well. And he said, well, go ahead. So I laid out a story and I wrote it the way I wanted to write it. And I had so much fun with it, I kept going. And now 45 years later.
Now, we do know that you have written other things than Redeeming Love. So yes. Of those things that you've written, what is your favorite?
Well, Redeeming Love is my favorite, but the last book I wrote that might be of interest to the kids is about, it's called The Masterpiece, and it's about a graffiti artist. And there again, it's about two characters who went through very traumatic events in their childhood. And it's how those traumatic events affected their thinking as an adult, how they each deal with it in different ways, but it's how those events in your childhood can really impact your entire life. And there again, the choices that you make and how you want to live the life that you want to have.
Now we have another question, and while I'm asking this one, I'll put out a reminder for people who might have other questions to go ahead and put them into the chat. But this question is from one of our adults who I can assure you blesses children all the time. In fact, he's going to be speaking tomorrow for us. But he would like to know how the actual process of writing Redeeming Love was different from your previous books. And I'm going to tag on how the process of writing the screenplay for Redeeming Love was different than reading the novel of Redeeming Love.
Well, I will tell you that writing Redeeming Love was, for me, a spiritual experience, because I spent so much time in Scripture I wanted it to be God's voice coming through, and Scripture being woven into the story through the character of Michael. And there were times when I literally felt like Jesus was in the room with me, basically telling me Angel's story, because I didn't have that kind of background. So I think he showed me things about her life that I was able to put in the story that I wouldn't have known without that. And as far as the screenplay, you can't have all the head knowledge. In a book, you can fill all that in of what are they thinking and how are they feeling. But in a screenplay, you have to see it all. It all has to be revealed through the dialogue and through the actual scenes. So that was the challenge for me, of cutting a book that was 400 plus pages down to 120 max. It's like 1 minute per page. So that was a real challenge for me. And I got the book on final draft, and I was reading about different how script writing and how you do it. And final draft is the processing program that you use, and that helped me set it all up. And then I didn't write it with the thought that they'd actually use it. I wrote it because I wanted to show them what I was looking for. And then when they read it, they went, "We'll take this." And then I worked with the director, DJ Caruso. We collaborated on the screenplay, because you can't have all that backstory in the beginning, because you'd have people getting up and walking out, watching an 8-year-old child be molested on the screen. Who wants to watch that? So it had to be restructured so that you're getting, where she is in present, and then the past that brought her there, and the healing process as it goes through. So all the elements of the story are in it, but it's structured in a way that the audience will understand without having all the heavy duty at the very beginning.
And is there any way we could extract some insider information from you about this film for next year?
Well, it will be PG-13, because I don't want an R-rated movie. Okay. It's very tastefully done. I mean, some of those rough scenes. I haven't seen the final cut yet, so I'm waiting to see the final cut. But it has to be PG-13. The book would be an R.
Yeah.
Kind of R. Yeah.
Not the version I show to the kids.
No. But, I mean, yeah, life is sometimes an R and sometimes life's an X.
Yeah. Let's say that Ismail is listening to all of this, or some of the other students joining us, Valeria or Ashanti, and they're going, you know what, I think I might want to be a writer one day. What kind of advice would you give to them?
Write the book you need to read.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
I'll let that marinate in their minds, maybe.
Yeah.
Write the book you think you need to read. I'll let that marinate in my mind for a while, actually.
Yeah.
I'm going to put out another call for questions. We are coming up at the end of our time. I want to be respectful of Mrs. Rivers' time. So while you're getting your last call in to ask some questions, I have a list of, I don't know what you would call them, but kind of rapid fire questions, things we might not be able to go into in too much depth, but just that. Okay. So the first one is, and this is from a member of our church. Have you gone on literary pilgrimages? Have you gone anywhere to just write, or maybe have you gone that are important to authors or books that you like?
I do go on a retreat now every year, but in the beginning, when I first started writing, there was no retreat because I had children. I started writing when I was pregnant with our first baby, and I lost that child. And then I kept writing, and I was also working. So there was no chance to retreat anywhere. I was literally writing with children around me. And when they were young, I had a baby in a cradlette behind my typewriter, because I was using a typewriter in the beginning. And I had one baby sleeping in the bottom drawer of my military desk. and another one behind me in a playpen. And that's just the way it did. And the kids have memories of that, because my older son took a class in college, and he said he wrote a poem about my mother's fingers because he could remember my typing, and it was a soothing sound to him. So, and I used to talk to them about, well, what did you dream last night? And then tell me the story, and then I'd ask questions and teach them how to build stories out of what you're dreaming. That wasn't exactly a short answer.
That's okay. I mean, as long as you're talking, I'm okay. I just try to make sure that that we get you off here when we said that we would. So another one is, if you could, this is kind of an interesting curveball. If you could invite 3 people to a dinner party, who would they be and why?
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
I have well, C.S. Lewis and Joy
Oh.
Davidson would be 2, but I would be serving them, and of course Jesus, but it'd be like I'd be serving them but just listening, be like just to hear their minds and hear their conversation. Brilliant people. And it's like, yeah. But I'd be kind of the fly on the wall or the servant, just putting things down and listening in on the conversation.
No, I don't know. I think you have a lot of things to contribute, but I do want to thank you for plugging probably the most famous Anglican of the 20th century. So thank you for mentioning C.S.
Great mind. Oh my goodness. Yeah.
I try to claim him anytime I can, but that's for us. But yeah, he's the world's. He's definitely not. Can't claim him to ourselves. Do you have a favorite season to write in? A favorite season to write in?
A favorite place to write in?
A season, like winter or spring.
Oh, a season. No, I write all year long. It doesn't matter. And I'm usually under contract, so I have a deadline. Mm-hmm. So it's not a matter of write when I am inspired. It's 90% planting your tailbone in that chair and doing the work.
Do you have a people that you would put on a list, or books that you'd put on a list for a junior high reading list, like a must-read book list for kids?
That's hard for me to say because I didn't really read when I was young. So I was reading all the Newbery Award winners when I was in my 30s and 40s.
Are you familiar with, we read this, can't believe it, the Giver series?
The which series?
Lois Lowry and The Giver and her
work.
Yes. Have you met her?
I have not, no. And the only book that I ever wrote that really was about kids, well, I've done a couple things, but the one, The Last Sin Eater, a young girl is the main character and a young boy. And that was the most fun I've ever had writing a book, was that particular story, because I had no clue what was happening. I started it and just let the characters kind of unfold as I started writing the story. But it's about a valley up in the Appalachian Mountains and a custom that was practiced up there and how it stood in the way of freedom, them being free.
As somebody who grew up in Appalachia, I'm kind of curious of what this custom might be. So
the Sin Eater.
A what?
The Sin Eater.
The Sin Eater. Okay.
Yeah, it was something that was brought over from Scotland and Wales, I think, in the 1800s, early 1800s, and I got letters from people saying it was not that far removed, but they had it over there, and it was really somebody that they would put out a meal, and the person would eat that meal believing that they were taking all the sins of that person on them so the person would rest in peace. But it was a twisted kind of gospel practice.
Okay. Wow.
Yeah. The opposite. The man thinks that he's saving his people, and he finds out he's not. He's actually standing in the way of salvation.
Wow. That's okay.
There's not much about it because they were pariahs. It was a hard thing to research.
Yeah. Yeah, people are. That's an area where people they're kind of closed off. So I can imagine you had some issues with getting people to talk up there. If I know my people, yeah. One last of the rapid fire, and then we'll go ahead and kind of wrap up. But who is your favorite author and why?
Frankly, the Bible. I spend most of my time reading the Bible. And as far as a favorite author, I think whatever I happen to be reading at the time, because every time you read a book, you are really getting to know that particular author, that particular writer. So it's like I pick things that I know are going to be good, craft-wise, and just thoroughly enjoy it. Right now, I'm reading Boys in the Boat, and it's fabulous. It's a great book. And then I have uh, my dear Mr. I think it's my dear Alexander. It's about Alexander Hamilton. So it's whatever I'm reading at the time, I am thoroughly enjoying. So to try to say this is my favorite author, I've never gotten where I read one author and just read every single book they've ever written. I tend to read nonfiction and fiction at the same time and back and forth, and I keep a list. I literally keep a list. At the end of the year, I look over the list. Am I overreading in any genre? Because I think as a writer, you need to be reading a lot of different things. And of course, I love C.S. Lewis.
Yeah, I just took a
tape letters. I think are my favorite.
Oh, above my desk,
letters.
Above my desk at work at the school, I actually have a quote from the Screw Tape Letters. Well, I just took it down, but it's the one where he says, mortals always think that we're putting ideas into their head, but we actually do our best work when we keep good ideas out of their heads.
Yeah.
So insightful. And that was worth taking the course on C.S. Lewis in seminary just for that quote.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. I found one question on the back of this. I was just about to wrap up, but this one's kind of so wacky and awesome that I have to ask you. Do you write in a particular font?
I actually use different fonts, but right now I'm using, I think it's Times Roman.
Okay.
So just something very, very clear. But then if there's a prayer and they're talking, then I use italics.
Okay.
But yeah.
Was it a computer or a typewriter?
I wrote it with well, no, actually it was the first book I wrote with a computer. And it was a nightmare because when I finished it, they had the floppy disks in those days, and I couldn't print it out. I could read it on the screen, but I could not print it out. So we had the IBM guy. I had an on-site maintenance agreement. He came and he couldn't figure out what was wrong. They changed out the printer. Then they had the programmer online. They had the IBM expert there, and they finally said, we don't know what's wrong with it. And it was printing gibberish, kind of going back and forth and printing all kinds of stuff. And so when they left, I literally laid my hands on the machine and just said, God, you made the people that created this thing. Would you please fix it? And it printed out and I was able to submit it. So that was kind of an interesting experience. I wasn't sure I wanted to keep working with a computer, but I've been working with a computer ever since.
Before we hang up, I want to pray quickly for everybody on the call, especially for Mrs. Rivers, and pray for blessings for her. So if you don't mind, Lord Jesus, I thank you for us being able to meet together virtually. I thank you for the gift of having Francine Rivers with us tonight, for sharing her love of writing, for sharing her gifts with us, for the impact that we know that this has made on our students and all the people who are going to watch the recording of this as well. I pray for the people who are watching this in recorded form, that they would be touched by what they've seen, that they would be inspired by some of the things that they've heard. Lord, I know that this is going to be something that the students who have been on this call tonight will probably remember for the rest of their lives, that time they got to meet the famous author of the story of love. And so I'm so grateful for that being added to their, no doubt added to their favorite childhood memories list that they'll be having as they get older. And I just thank you again for Mrs. Rivers being with us tonight. I ask that you would bless the rest of our week here as we go through Education Week and honor our desire to help parents and help students to tap into your gift of learning, to become the people that you have intended for them to be, and that you would continue to fill the holes in our hearts that only you can fill, that you would give us the courage to stop trying to fill those things with other things like with Angel and Sarah, Lord, but that you would show us you are our Michael Hosea, that you are the one who's redeemed us and wants to restore us and loves us from the bottom of your heart. And I thank you and praise you in the mighty name of Jesus Christ. Amen.
Yeah.
Mrs. Rivers, thank you again so much for joining us tonight. God bless you for sharing your gifts with us and with our students here in Deep South Texas.
Thank you very much for the opportunity.
Of course, anytime. And thank you also to the parents who have been joining us on the call as well. I want to encourage you that your effort to be here tonight with your kids says a lot about your care and your compassion for your family and the children in your life. I want you to trust that God is going to reward you for spending this time with us tonight. Thank you again to everyone. Have a blessed evening and stay safe in the Lord Jesus Christ. Amen.